Trump or Harris, which is better for China? Source, Shiu Sin-por. How can I make sure that my election is as good as my election? What is the best way to win the election? Guancha, the U.S. presidential election that has attracted global attention will take place next Tuesday, November 5. Early voting has begun in some states and has received enthusiastic responses from voters across the country, with tens of millions of early voters. The competition between the two candidates is extremely fierce, and most voters have already made up their minds at this final stage. Therefore, both sides are focusing on encouraging their supporters to vote, while making a last-ditch effort to win the support of moderate voters in some swing states. The results of the vote in these 7 swing states will determine whether Trump or Harris will be the winner. In general, current polls show that the level of support between the two sides is very close. Estimates show that the voter turnout in this election will be very high. The decisive link is likely to be a difference of tens of thousands, or even thousands of votes in a state. Chinese scholars and think tank researchers have very different opinions on who will win. But there is a very common view that the result of this election, that is, whether Trump or Harris is elected, will not have a big difference in terms of impact on China. Many foreign observers also have similar views. However, I think this view is a bit biased and fundamentally incorrect. Such a judgment may be true to a certain extent, but in some specific issues and categories, different election results will lead to very different consequences, and these differences are very important for China. Here, we will conduct analysis and assessment at several different levels and categories on the impacts that the election results will bring to China. There are differences in how the Republicans and Democrats, Trump and Harris, view China, but the common point between them is still the main aspect. Both sides have in common that they regard China as the number one opponent, and that they should do their best to contain and slow down China's development and not let China surpass the United States. Faced with China's rise, U.S. leaders must strive to contain China's development in the next 10 years or so, while using this period to consolidate their own strength. This has become a relatively consistent view among the elite and many Americans. Therefore, no matter who is elected U.S. president, China will not have an easy time. This is a common view. However, there are some differences between the two candidates to this basic consensus, because they have different views on the situation and role of the United States in the international arena, and the differences in their handling methods and attitudes are even greater. The most fundamental difference between the two sides is that if Harris is elected, she will generally continue the Biden administration's China strategy, and the possibility of change is very small. Even if there is an adjustment, the extent will be limited, and the situation of China-US relations will be relatively clear. However, if Trump is elected, although the direction and goals of the U.S. towards China will not change, the changes in the means and intensity of policy will be greater and more difficult to predict. Both parties regard China as their number one enemy. However, on the surface, the Democratic Party is more ideologically driven, believing that China's rise will challenge U.S. and Western values, and shake U.S. leadership and the international order established by the U.S. and the West. Therefore, they believe that the nature of the competition between China and the U.S. is mainly a competition between two regimes, models, and values. During his 4-year term, Biden has built a series of strategies based on this way of thinking, as well as gathered U.S. allies on this basis to prevent China from further developing in the fields of high technology, military and key economic links. If elected, Harris will generally continue to move in this direction. On the Republican side, referring mainly to Trump, they rely more on practical interests and believe that China has achieved development by harming U.S. economic interests, so-called theft of intellectual property rights and unfair trade practices, and will in the long run undermine U.S. leadership, so it is necessary to contain this force and protect U.S. interests. If elected, Trump will focus on relatively practical measures such as economics, trade, and tariffs, with the goal of bringing some industries that have an important impact on economic growth, employment, and tariffs back to the U.S. Trump has taken this approach in his previous presidency, and the policy he is promoting in this election is about the basic idea is the same. Although both Trump and Harris regard China as the number one enemy, because the two sides have different views and working principles, for China, dealing with Harris is probably easier than with Trump. From another perspective, for China, the possibility of finding a compromise with Harris is relatively small, while bargaining with Trump is more likely, because Trump considers himself a very smart and good businessman, and can negotiate anything. In other words, dealing with Harris is probably more difficult than dealing with Trump. This is our basic assessment. Of course, we should not ignore Trump's fickle, unprincipled, and extremist personality. It is difficult to predict what specific measures Trump will take to contain China. If Trump is elected, the more favorable factor for China will be the possible changes in the way the U.S. handles international relations. Trump's campaign slogans such as America First and Make America Great Again do not mean much when taken literally. After all, any U.S. president will put the interests of the U.S. first and above all other considerations. But in reality, the real meaning of these slogans is about narrowing and isolationism. What Trump really wants to do is to narrow and reduce the global burden and responsibility of the U.S., and focus policy on the U.S. domestically. At the same time, Trump believes that America's involvement in many different regions of the world is a losing business. America is being manipulated and exploited by others, and that is a burden for this country. He believes that the relationship between the U.S. and its allies is unfair and harms the development of the U.S. itself. This is an important difference between Trump and Harris in international relations, although there are many people in the Republican Party who do not share Trump's views. In fact, Trump has acknowledged that the current U.S. national power is limited and has tried to reduce global responsibilities and reduce the U.S. burden, while asking allies such as NATO, Japan, and South Korea to increase defense investment and bring more benefits to the U.S. to compensate for what the U.S. has spent. However, doing so will increase conflicts and differences, and weaken the solidarity and cooperation between the U.S. and its allies. The EU has set up a special committee to respond to these possible major changes. Biden's efforts to attract allies to contain China will also fail, which will give China more opportunities to improve relations with Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Trump's election will affect allies and partners, first of all Europe, then Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. What is at the forefront is the war between Russia and Ukraine. Trump made it clear during the election campaign that if elected, he would end the war as soon as possible. As the largest supporter of this war, the U.S. is fully capable of suspending it. This move would create a huge blow to Western Europe and seriously affect the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. For the Middle East, due to the influence of Jewish forces in the U.S., Trump's policy towards Israel will not change much. Whether Trump or Harris is elected, this will be the biggest and most important difference in the impact on China. Because if the relationship between the U.S. and the above allies deteriorates, these countries will need to re-evaluate their relationship with the U.S. as well as their own position in international relations. This will be a great opportunity for China to resolve and ease many problems between itself and these countries. If Trump is elected, coupled with his boastful personal relationship with Putin, the relationship between the U.S., Russia and North Korea will also change and move towards harmony, even change for the better. There may be fundamental improvements in US-Russia relations. But if Harris is elected, this situation will absolutely not happen. Some people in the U.S., such as Professor Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, believe that China is the biggest threat to the U.S. The U.S. should join forces with Russia to deal with China, not be hostile to Russia. Therefore, there is an opinion that if Trump is elected, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia will have fundamental changes. The U.S. and Russia will join hands to deal with China. But I don't think this will happen, because after experiencing NATO's broken promises and its aggressive eastward expansion and the war in Ukraine, Russia no longer has sincere hopes of returning to the West, especially to the arms of the United States. Even if the United States and Russia normalize relations, after all, Sino-Russian relations after the development of the past few years will not have a big step backward. Putin is not that stupid and he is not short-sighted. As for the Taiwan issue, the issue that we have the differences in views and policies between Harris and Trump are becoming more and more apparent and have a greater impact on us. The Biden administration attaches great importance to the strategic role of the first island chain in the Pacific, as well as the negative impacts on the geopolitical position and prestige of the United States in East Asia if Taiwan's position changes. Democratic lawmakers also like to use Taiwan to provoke China. If Harris is elected, these policies will continue. However, Trump does not see things that way at all. Trump has said that Taiwan is not related to the fundamental interests of the United States and that he does not value Taiwan's geopolitical role, which is consistent with his personal views on international relations. Trump even said that Taiwan has stolen American chip technology and still needs the United States protection, so Taiwan should pay more for protection. This reflects that Trump's attitude is completely opposite to the Democratic Party's view on Taiwan policy. If elected, Trump will start from immediate and short-term practical interests. On the one hand, he will ask Taiwan to buy more weapons, on the other hand, he will consider Taiwan as a pawn in negotiations with China. Therefore, provocative actions on the issue of Taiwan independence will also be somewhat restrained. Similar changes will occur in the Philippines, and thus the tension in the South China Sea will be reduced. In addition, for various reasons, regardless of who occupies the White House in the next U.S. administration, that person's key officials and subordinates will also be important, even pivotal, factors in policy making. As for Trump, he has strong opinions, but many of them are based on simple perception and emotional reactions, and his countermeasures are also mainly based on intuition, which will inevitably lead to control and dissuasion from his subordinates. No matter how subjective he is, Trump still has a certain respect for his subordinates and will respect their opinions on many issues. As for Harris, it is clear from the election campaign that she is lacking in substance, lacking in depth, and only puts forward a few principles, white left views on policy. A White House under Harris will in fact be a White House under the influence of her officials and subordinates. Of course, Harris still has absolute power to decide who will be her subordinates. At the level of fundamental issues in China-US relations and the nature of the conflict between the two sides, there will not be much difference regardless of who is elected. But on some specific issues, whether they are regional issues, geopolitical issues, or the international relations situation, especially the Taiwan issue that we attach special importance to, there will be big differences because the two sides have different fundamental working principles. It is extremely important for us to understand these differences. It is difficult for the outside world to influence the outcome of the U.S. election, but early preparations are needed to deal with the impacts that this outcome may bring.